right now. All right. All right, my friends. So we got Phil Leigh with us here today, and he had written one of the best books I've ever read called Southern Reconstruction. The powerful account of the devastating long-term effect on the Reconstruction politics of both Black and white Southerners. And I think this is so important to understand today, because what we're going through right now, we've been through before in terms of the past. There's just no, and there's my dog, Phil, by the way. I got another one who's sitting over there. And so he wants to say hello.
Okay.
I want to introduce him, and he's got a YouTube video. We'll put links to the show notes. He's got an Amazon page, the whole thing. But I cannot tell you how much I marked this book up, and to have him on this program is just fantastic. So, Phil, welcome to the website, or welcome to the YouTube channel, sir.
Thank you.
So you are in Tampa right now, but tell us backstory of who Phil Leigh is, and how. Just tell your backstory if you would. We'd love to hear it. Take as much time as you want.
All right. Well, I've been interested in the American Civil War since I was a boy. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and when I learned that the part of the war actually occurred in the state where I lived, then that fascinated me. Then I went up to Chicago and I went to Wall Street, and then after Wall Street, I came down to Florida and worked for an investment management firm down here as a stock analyst. I was a stock analyst also up on Wall Street.
So you were in my bit. Okay, cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, I was a stock analyst,
right?
And then when I got toward the toward the end of my career in that business, the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War came along. From 2011 to 2015, the New York Times, back in those days, was publishing about 3 articles a week on to commemorate the sesquicentennial, and they typically went to professors to get them to write about something that had occurred 150 years ago that week or that day or something like that. So I was reading them for about 6 months, and I thought, I can do some of this stuff better than the guys that they're getting are just, the writing is bad, there's no storytelling.
Right. Oh,
so what I did is, between Christmas and New Year's, things slow down, right? So I wrote an article and submitted it to the New York Times. I had to find the specific editor. Anyone that wants to get published there, you better don't go through the submissions page. All that stuff gets ignored. But I found the specific editor responsible for that series. I contacted him with what the story is the biggest mistake the Federals made during the Civil War. And within 2 weeks, he got back to me and said he wanted to publish it.
Wow, cool.
Yeah. So then I did another 21 articles for the New York Times, and they stopped that series stopped in 2015. So then I started, that helped me get a publisher for my books. And so I started writing my books. Now for the book that you wrote, I would say that the main message there is, or one of the main messages is, I saw an interview with Shelby Foote. You're familiar with him, right?
Absolutely.
And so the author, the interviewer asked us, well, how do you know what you're going to write? And he says, well, people think that the author has all the answers.
Right.
That's not true. The author is writing the book in order to find the answers. And that was exactly what I did. I was kind of suspicious that because I saw the way the books on the Civil War after James McPherson's book, Battle Cry of Freedom in the late 1980s, all of them were really kind of increasingly demonizing the South.
Yeah.
So I thought that Reconstruction, if I researched it on my own, I might find a different story, and I did. I found a different story.
Oh, so you didn't go in there with a knowledge of the Reconstruction other than, interesting. I
had no knowledge other than what the academics gave us, and the academics are 98% focused on the Black experience.
Yes.
As though Reconstruction had no effect on whites.
Right.
One of the things I discovered that was kind of surprising, because there was back when that book was published, there was beginning to be some talk about reparations.
Right.
And so what I was able to show is that white Southerners have already paid reparations, if not for slavery, then for losing the war. And here's how it works. For the first 25 years after the war, more than half of the federal budget was dedicated to things that did not benefit former Confederates in any way. For example, the interest on the federal debt. The Southerners had to pay their share of taxes for that interest on the federal debt. The surpluses, the budgets were surpluses in those days because the government wanted to pay down the federal debt. They actually did that back in the 19th century. So Southerners had to pay their share of tax to reduce the federal debt. And then third were the Union veterans pensions.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The Union veterans pensions total over $8 billion. The total cost of the war, I think, was estimated at $5 billion. Yeah, and the last Union veterans pension was paid in May of 2020. Because what they did is they kept increasing the eligibility, and they did that for the obvious reason. It was the Republicans. The Republicans in the 19th century and the early 20th century wanted high tariffs. The Midwesterners did not, because they were starting to export their agricultural products. But the Republicans essentially bribed them, because there were so many Union veterans at that time that they were able to swing Indiana and important states like that to the Republican column. It wasn't until, well, here's the thing, tariffs, this is another interesting point. The typical historian will tell you the war was all about slavery. If you read the secession documents, the explanation of why each individual state seceded, you will find that they seceded over slavery, but and the tariffs had nothing to do with it. But if you simply ask the question, well, why didn't the North let the first 7 cotton states leave in peace? Well, part of the reason they didn't do that is because they did not want a country on their southern border that had no tariffs. And so the tariffs prior to the Civil War, the United States tariffs on dutiable items were 19%. For the next 50 years, they averaged 45%. So the point is that wasn't the South that went to war partially for tariffs. It was the North. They did not want a country below their border that had no tariffs. And here's why. In 1866, when the South needed to rebuild, the year after the Civil War, railroad iron in the United States cost $85 a ton. You could buy it in Liverpool for $32 a ton. So what the North was really interested in was not collections on the tariff. They wanted to monopolize the biggest industrial industries in the United States, and that's what they did. So there wasn't much tariff collected on railroad iron because there weren't going to be any imports. But what had happened is Pennsylvania and the other northern states essentially made the iron industry a domestic monopoly, and that did not benefit the South in any way.
And you even talk about that. You said Birmingham, and Birmingham, you know what I'm saying?
Eventually what happened is, of course, they found they had coal and iron and rich iron deposits near Birmingham. So Birmingham, during the late 19th century, started to become a competitor to the steel and iron companies in the North. Well, in 1889, I think Andrew Carnegie visited the South, and he said our biggest threat is the Southern iron industry. Well, what they did is they acquired it. And then once they acquired it, what they did with their customers, they said, okay, if you want to buy Birmingham iron, that's fine. We want you to buy Pittsburgh iron, but if you want to buy Birmingham, that's fine. But here's the deal, as Biden would say. To get it shipped to you in, let's say, Dallas, Texas, to get it shipped to you in Dallas, Texas, we are going to charge you a freight from Birmingham to Dallas, but we're also going to charge you freight from Pittsburgh to Dallas. You have to pay both, even though we're not shipping from Pittsburgh. And on top of that, you have to pay initially it was a $2 per ton Birmingham differential, which meant, for every ton you buy from Birmingham, you've got to pay a $2 premium in price. And I do want to just, and I'm speaking, of course, here spontaneously. It may be that the freight charge from Birmingham to Dallas might have been lower, but they still charged you the Pittsburgh rate, and not both of them. I think that might be the right way to put it. But anyway, I was discovering all of this.
And so you never knew any of this. You thought, I mean, you're from the South, so obviously you had a different learning than I did from Maine, but still, at the end of the day, the South.
When a guy comes to you and says, you need to buy XYZ stock, right? Okay, so he's done his research and he's got all his answers,
right?
But you're experienced enough to know these things don't always work. So you're like, where's the mistake in this story?
Right.
And so I was looking at the history of the Reconstruction the same way. It was all coming out from, it was all the same monolithic interpretation focused on blacks. And I said, all right, where's the problem in this story? And that's, as a stock analyst, I tried to do my best on that. And in your business, you try to do the same. We just can't trust, the stuff that we're getting. We got to question it. And so by questioning it, I found a lot of holes in the story. And that doesn't mean I was, praising the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
Obviously, I wasn't, but it is interesting.
That's what, if you read the book, there is absolutely no praise for the Klan. I mean, this drives me up the wall. It's like anyone that takes an alternative position is automatically a Klansman. You're like, this is freaking insane. Like that has no, it's not. It actually drives me up the wall, which is one of the reasons I love the book, because I sit there thinking, it's actually a fair-minded view of not only how it affected blacks, which it did. Slavery is horrible for blacks, but also how the blacks and whites were at the beck and call of the aristocrats in the South and the Northern industrialists. And that ultimately has one of my questions, ultimately, and I got to let my dog in. Do you think the whole Civil War essentially was boiled down to the Northern industrialists versus the Southern aristocrats in some regard? I mean, with blacks, poor whites, and blacks being thrown in as their kind of pawns, if that makes sense.
Well, I think, the way I look at it is that the South essentially became an internal colony of the United States, and it was economically exploited. A comparable situation was the way the British exploited Ireland. Okay. So that's really what happened. So if you say, for example, well, tariffs were part of the war, the academics come back to you and you say, oh, that's all bullshit. The South did not succeed. And they'll give you some explanations like the tariffs were at a low point before the war, so therefore there was no. But they completely, utterly missed the point that it wasn't the South that went to war over tariffs. It was the North. And as I pointed out, before the war, tariffs on dutiable items was 19%. They did not go down until Woodrow Wilson, born in the South, became president in 1913. Then they dropped pretty substantially. But then the roaring 20s came around, and they went right back up because you had, Coolidge, Harding, Hoover, and then you had the Great Depression. So then, the Democrats are in charge again, and they start to think, well, what do we need to do here to get, to get out of this depression? But they were actually facing a possible communist revolution here. So
exactly.
They started to lower tariffs a little bit during the Depression, but they did not really reduce tariffs substantially until after World War II. And here's the reason, which really is enlightening when you think about that.
Hold on just a second. I got just stay there. I'm just going to stop recording for just. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so the point is that tariffs before the Civil War, 50 years thereafter, 45% on average. They dropped during the Woodrow Wilson administration, go right back up during the Roaring 20s, and start to come down during the Depression. But the real big drop in American tariffs came after World War II, for the simple reason that the states north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line realized they had no competition anywhere in the world for industrial goods. Now all of a sudden they want everybody to lower their tariffs.
Yes, right.
So they can sell to Europe and they can sell to Asia, and that's exactly what happened. And then of course they go in thinking, well, You're not old enough to remember. There used to be a time when if you got a toy from Japan, it was like, oh, that's cheap crap.
Right.
Yeah, and Detroit and the companies north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line thought they were just going to dominate the world with their industrial capabilities, but it didn't turn out that way. And I can remember in the South was really kind of like a colony.
Yeah.
We could buy their industrial goods, but they didn't want us making anything. And I can remember as a boy going around on my paper route, there was another boy, and he was a big fan of Chrysler, and I was a big fan of General Motors. And I just said, well, I'm going to count up all the cars here and see, who owns what, you know? And at the time, of course, it was General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. And they're nothing now. But I remember thinking at that time that, man, all the wealth is up north. That's the impression it left me. All the wealth is up north. Even the factory workers even live better than the average person in Little Rock. That's what I was realizing. And but it was because the South had been an internal colony. And of course, what happened up north is they got sloppy. They just, they felt like, well, we don't have any competition. We can do almost anything we want. I've seen a photograph, a before and after photograph of Hiroshima. After the bomb, it's a disaster. But in what is it now? 55 plus 20, 75 years, 65 years later, bright lights everywhere. Yeah. You do the opposite. You take a picture of Detroit in 1945, and it's just full of activity. And you take a picture of Detroit, an aerial picture of Detroit now, and it's desolate. But so that is really one of the missing elements, is that the Reconstruction lasted a lot longer than the academics teach. And the reason they don't want to teach is that they don't want this knowledge to get out.
It turns on the narrative. The other thing you said too is like, that there's no benefits at all for Confederate soldiers. The Union pensions were growing through the roof just as a bribe to vote. You know what I'm saying? And and you're like, this was amazing to me. They're like, oh yeah, but the Southern governments didn't take care of blacks. It only took care of white Confederate soldiers. You're like, yeah, because they weren't getting anything from the North. Like they shut off, like the whole thing of the narrative is like, oh yes, the Southern governments are racist, only given to the white Confederates on the pensions, I should say. And you're like, well, you said because they weren't getting anything from the North. It was the federal government was taxing Southerners as well as Northerners to pay the growing burden of the Union pensions. They were not giving anything to the Confederate soldiers.
Yeah, it was like telling Japan and Germany, look, okay, you guys want to take care of your soldiers, and we understand they were wounded, and go ahead and collect your taxes and pay them. Oh, but by the way, you need to pay the United States some money too for our soldiers, for the GI Bill and all this other stuff. We didn't do that. We did it to the South, but we did not do it to Japan or Germany. All those expenses that I cited would have been reparations if the South had been a defeated independent country.
Right.
They were not an independent country, so they did have some say in Washington, but their party was out of power until Woodrow Wilson, and then only temporarily.
But I'm just sitting there thinking, this is a blatant lie by omission. You know what I'm saying? It's like you guys are saying, the guys on the left, and they're saying, oh, well, look, they're racist from the get-go. You're like, what? You have these people and they still weren't making, it wasn't like they're making bank. And I'm sitting there in these union pensions, like you say, we just stopped. It's crazy. It actually annoys. It's like this again. It's another thing. It's like I don't trust any of them, because if they're making these blatant lies of omission, what else are they doing? And then going back to the tariff thing, I had never even heard of the tariff thing as an issue at all until I read your book. I said, well, it makes sense. It completely makes sense. They want to dominate, like you said, as an internal colony.
Yeah. Well, the top three industries prior to the Civil War were cotton textiles, woolen textiles, and iron products. All three of them were protected by tariffs. And this is important to keep in mind, because the academics will say, well, they didn't collect much tariff there. That wasn't a big deal. And then if they did collect tariffs, most of the population was in the North, and therefore they paid. That is not the point. The point is a protective tariff is not designed to collect revenue.
Right.
It is designed to block competition.
Yes.
And they did that. They did that until after World War II.
Well, the great example you give is in Rhode Island. You talk about the Rhode Island. You know that off the top of your head, where I got it But you know the Rhode Island example that you had written about? Does that ring a bell to you?
Are you talking about the Sprague?
Well, they had like the steel tariffs or something like that in Rhode Island to basically, here, I'll see if I can't find it, but it was an amazing story. And I was like, I had never heard this, and be honest, I studied economics. I was like, whoa, I did not even know about that, but I probably won't be able to find it. But basically what happened was, at the end of the day, Rhode Island has own, and I'm going to completely butcher this, but they had their own tariff on, I want to say steel or iron or something like that. And people are like, well, that wouldn't make sense. That hurt the domestics. That ultimately it did not actually help the people in Rhode Island, the workers, because they could charge a higher fee. I can't remember the whole story.
Actually, what I was doing there, that was a hypothetical explanation of how tariffs work. I said, okay, let's assume that they have a tariff in Rhode Island on lumber.
Yes.
Okay? Then what will happen if Connecticut has lower prices? And then ultimately what happens is that it just doesn't work out economically.
But it doesn't work out economically. However, but you can see how it has this short-term appeal for the workers in that business. It was just
exactly. I mean, if Rhode Island were to build massive greenhouses, right, they could have been a cotton state, but it makes no sense.
Right.
And that's essentially what tariffs do to a certain extent.
Right.
That's just an extreme example.
Right. No, understood. But it was
a hypothetical example, but that's what tariffs do, and that's why the North continued to have the advantage in steel and iron, because they would not let Birmingham steel go into the North without higher freight rates.
And so talk about the banking discrimination too, because I have that as I tell you, man, I'm sitting there, I'm reading this book, I'm like, we're going through this whole thing all over again. The elites in the banking, the elites in industrial, this Texas stuff. But anyway, the banking discrimination against the South, I thought that was, again, just another blow across the head. It's like, man, I never, and look, I pride myself in knowing economic history, and I'm sitting there thinking that inherently makes sense. I don't know if that rings a bell to you.
There's a number of things about it that come into play, but it really links to the fact that during the Civil War, most people realize this, that have an economic background, the federal government did not have enough gold to keep, to keep backing it.
Yeah.
So they had to get off of the gold standard. And what they started doing is they started issuing what they call greenbacks. And that's why our currency is still green. But prior to that, I don't know if you're aware, but prior to that, the government did not print any money. They could coin, they could stamp out coins, but they were not permitted to print money, paper money. And as a result, the money if they did coins, they were typically to use either silver or gold, and but no paper money. So as a result, most of the paper money that circulated were independent banknotes, like say, let's say the most prominent bank in Portland, Maine would have its own banknotes, and people trusted them because, oh yeah, we know that bank, we know them, they're conservative people, and so you would just trade those around. And then same thing like in Boston, some of the most conservative banks in the country were up there, so those banknotes would trade well. And but that was where most of the money was. Like they would be $1 in Portland, and it'd be $1 in Boston, but the banks were trusted, so they were interchangeable. Some of the banks out west were actually called Wildcat because they were so far out there. That's where the term Wildcat comes from.
Oh, I didn't know
that. Their paper currency wasn't as reliable, so they wouldn't trade it. But then the government gets involved, and they print greenbacks, and then so the greenbacks become the standard. And so every bank note, because banknotes in those days, that Portland Bank and that Boston Bank, if you took a $5 bill to them or their banknote, they'd give you $5 in gold. But they had to stop doing that in December of 1861, the first year of the war. So that's when the greenbacks come around. So then the bank said, well, we're not going to be able, the banknotes, we're not going to be able to give you gold, but we'll give you greenbacks. So you bring in a $5 Portland banknote, we'll give you a $5 greenback.
Yeah.
So basically everything went, there was just no gold backing anymore.
Right.
And so then the next, and they said the National Banking Act. So then that's where the national banks come from. The National Banking Act was a great boon to the U.S. Treasury and the banking industry up north, because what the U.S. Treasury said is, you don't have to use gold as reserves anymore.
Right.
You can use treasury bonds. And the bankers go like, well, if I use treasury bonds, then my reserves will pay interest. And gold does not pay interest. So yeah, that's a good deal for me. And for the federal government said, yeah, that's a damn good deal for us too, because we need to sell a lot of bonds.
Right.
So then the bank said, well, I'll get interest on my reserves where I never got interest on my reserves before, and I'll also get interest on my loans. So this is a great deal.
Right.
And it's continued to be an unholy alliance to the present. Well, after the Civil War, national banks had to be chartered. So guess what? When the southern states started to come into the market, the Washington says, well, we can't issue any more charters because there are too many banknotes circulating. That was the biggest problem. And the other problem was that they held them to the same reserve standards that the banks in the north, and they didn't have the money.
Right.
But I'll tell you, the most interesting thing is that when they went to greenbacks, California and Oregon said, screw you. Screw you. We are not taking greenbacks, not at face value. You may tell us it's legal tender and we have to do it, but we're not doing it. And so in California and Oregon, they defied the Washington government, but did not get invaded like the southern states did. They would not trade greenbacks for gold at par. They would do it at the fluctuated rate that was determined in Washington, or not Washington, but in the New York gold room. And the reason that happened is because if you wanted to import something from, say, Great Britain, they'd say the same thing. Don't try and pay me with greenbacks.
Right.
You got to pay me in gold. So there had to be an exchange to figure out the ratio. Well, that exchange ratio between gold and greenbacks fluctuated. So it went to its lowest point. At one point, it was worth 35 cents each. Greenback was worth 35 cents in gold, and that was late in the war. It was actually in June of 1864, because Grant was stalled at Petersburg.
Yes.
The bankers up north figured, he's going to be in Richmond by then, but he wasn't, and he wasn't making any further progress. So they went way down to 35 cents. Well, the interesting thing, the big advantage to the northern was if you buy these bonds, and the banks bought them, and the consumers bought them, or the ordinary families, just to support the government, they would buy them with paper money.
Right.
And as soon as U.S. Grant became president, right after Andrew Johnson, the first bill he signed was the Public Credit Act, which said all of these bonds that you bought with paper money, as low as 35 cents on the dollar, they're going to be redeemed in gold.
Yeah, at the
yeah. And there was a huge benefit to the people that owned the bonds,
yes,
which were all Northerners, but not Southerners.
And Southerners had to pay the tax in order to fund the money to pay the bank.
Yeah. And then none of this stuff comes out. None of this. You don't find Eric Foner talking about it, or James McPherson, or even the people at the University of Georgia.
Oh, no.
And the interesting thing is that the Public Credit Act, again, that was the first thing that President Grant signed. Well, he let's put it this way, he owned bonds. Okay.
So, he enriched all these guys. They say, wait, I can buy it 35 cents and turn around and get gold back for it?
Yeah.
It's the best.
To be truthful, the 35 cents was the low point. And I really don't know what the average is. I've got a graph on it. But nonetheless, it was always a discount. And so even if it was like, say, 80% of par, that meant you still got a 25% bonus when you got your bonds redeemed. And and that's just another thing that I had to dig all this stuff out.
They're thinking, this is the deal of a lifetime for the moneyed interest, which were the Northern industrialists again. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? And to sit there, I'm sitting there thinking, this is a complete payoff to Grant and the guys who funded the Civil War. It was completely. And then they got paid twice. I did actually a video on this where I used your book. I said, this is insane, because it's literally I'm just simply, I was so, frankly, so pissed off. I was like, this has never been told. And it really infuriates me because it acts as everyone wants to say, the good guys are in the North who hated slavery and they loved the blacks, and the bad guys are in the South who loved slavery and they hated the blacks. And yet it's not like that at all. I mean, there's some of that, the Southern aristocrats, I grant you, but at the end of the day, the regular Joe Schmoes down here, they didn't care. They're like, dude, I'm just trying to, they had no money. That's great. I mean,
just as to help put this in perspective, is the way banking started.
Yes.
In the Western, at least in the American and British society, I can't remember it was during the just prior to the English Civil War. The British Mint was a safe place to keep your bullion. So when the war came along, the king said, I can't give you your money back now. I thank you for depositing your gold here, but I can't give it to you now because I need to fight this war. So everybody said they didn't like that. So what they did is, when he eventually did pay them back, they started, they would not deposit their gold with the king's mint anymore. So they would deposit it with goldsmiths, people that would, make jewelry and that sort of thing. So the goldsmiths then, you would go in and give them $100 worth of gold, and he'd give you a certificate, for $100 that you could redeem at his goldsmith shop. And basically the certificate became money, right? You would have different denominations for how much you deposited there. And he's thinking, okay, I've got all this gold here and all those circulating paper notes, the receipts, they're basically receipts. And people are going to hold those receipts and they're not going to really demand it. So if let me just say, I'll take half the gold and lend out money and just create money on that. And so that's how the reserve system started.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it was not regulated. So the reliability of those paper notes depended upon the character of the bank or the goldsmith. Right. Which some people argue is still the way we ought to go, because the government is not trustworthy. Every time the government sets a minimum standard, everybody goes to that standard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so when they set a minimum standard, if they lower it to try to stimulate the economy, everybody goes to that minimum standard.
Absolutely.
And stays there. Well, every time they go to a new minimum, there's greater risk in the whole thing. So you've got a house of cards.
No, it's the FDIC. I mean, literally, the FDIC insurance thing is such a scam, because it says at the end of the day, if you have FDIC, there's no risk to your dollars by going to that bank. That's what people think. And so you have these banks. I'll never forget, a lot of guys were selling bonds from the Bank of Puerto Rico. They're actually CDs sold on as if a bond. And you're like, well, the Bank of Puerto Rico is up FDIC coverage. And it was a completely not capitalized well bank. Anyway, and so guess who owns when the Bank of Puerto Rico has issues? You and I, the taxpayer, all holding the wet bag. It's the same thing. It's a minimum standard to get the FDIC coverage. It's no different than the EU. What's going on right now? The euro. Greece has the same gold backing as Germany, which is inherently stupid. But that's it's the race to the bottom. To the
But for the United States, it all started in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War with the National Banking Acts, and then a year prior to that with the Greenback, with the Legal Tender Act.
Actually, it's funny because one of the first notes I have is fractional reserves on page 15. I said, this is exactly, and you get a good history of the goldsmith. And it was just fantastic, man. You get a good history of the goldsmithing and the economist to me, who very much enjoys the idea of how money is and the value of money and all that, and the circulation. It's not just the government doesn't just print it like modern monetary theorist says. There's actually got to be a value behind it. It's very interesting, because that was another hit to the theory that the government just creates the money out of the blue. It just doesn't happen like that. I mean, it happens because, like you said, of people who have a value in that when they turn in that circulated means of exchange, it's going to be worth something upon redemption. And I was amazed by that. Was so quick in the book, and my economist mind said, oh man, that kind of got me. And I wish I could show you how many freaking things I have on that, because it's just nuts. And then, but you think about what's happening today. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. I'm just sitting there thinking, and I want to keep a little bit more focused on the reparations thing, because the idea that there's like this white privilege. It actually just, I'm a poor kid from Maine. I remember government cheese. I was raised on an island in Maine, and look, if you're raised in America, you're wealthier than 99% of the world, I grant you. But still, I very much remember government cheese, the whole thing. But in food stamps, the orange money, I think I even have a $5 food stamp here to always remember, from where it came. But talk about the whites in the South, if you don't mind, Phil, just the idea that all these whites were, we're very happy and we're living large, if that makes sense. I find that to be such a fraud perpetuated on just an ignorant society, that the whites in the South were somehow they loved slavery, and they were very keen on keeping it because most whites had nothing to do with it, if that makes sense.
Well, before the Civil War, if you take the 11-state Confederacy, in terms of family ownership, about 30% of the families owned slaves.
Yeah.
But typically it was the patriarch that was the title holder. So therefore you'll find, people at the Sons of Confederate Veterans will say, well, less than 1% or less than 10% of the people in the South owned slaves. And technically that's right. But to get a better figure of merit, you have to take into account the family. If the patriarch owns, it's the whole family.
Right.
But still, it was only 30%, which means that more than 2 to 1, or at least, about 2 to 1 of the soldiers did not own slaves at all. And after the Civil War,
yes,
the whole country was, it was ruined. It was just utterly ruined. About 2/3 of all the mules and livestock had been killed. So when they would go home, Grant told them, go home, surrender to Appomattox, go back to your little farms and, plant your corn or whatever you're going to plant and get it done. Well, they went back to their farms, and they would use if they had a mule, they'd use it. They'd loan that out to other people that didn't have it. And if they didn't have a mule and they couldn't borrow one, they'd hitch themselves to the harness to plow the fields. And it was not easy on anyone. Now the blacks had the protection of the Freedmen's Bureau, which would intervene pretty routinely between black laborers and large landowners for contract labor on the farm. And so they initially got a good start there. But then, of course, since there was no money, it really didn't last very long before they had to come up with a way that they could run the business without money. And that turned out to be sharecropping.
Yes.
Sharecropping was not just blacks.
Yes.
In fact, by as late as 1940, the majority of the sharecroppers were white. And about 2/3 of the tenant owners, who were not sharecroppers in the sense, but they just rented the land on the farms, they were also white. And they were poor. I mean, the sharecroppers in the Great Depression made between 15 and 25 cents a day. And it was in the economic status of the white sharecropper and the black sharecropper were almost identical.
Yeah.
The white sharecropper had the advantage of the social advantage
right.
of being able to think of himself as a superior race. And then you did have you had the segregation and the so-called Jim Crow.
Right.
But in truth, that feeling was pervasive in the United States. It just, there weren't any blacks in the North.
Exactly.
Or hardly any blacks in the North. And as a matter of fact, during the Civil War, one Kentucky senator, Kentucky stayed in the Union officially. So one of the Kentucky senators introduced a bill which would require the refugee blacks from the 11 Confederate states to be distributed among the northern states in proportion to population. That bill went nowhere. The big abolitionists like Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. I mean, you go to any campus today and ask, is Charles Sumner, does he rank ahead of Moses and behind Peter and somewhere? And they think he was a wonderful, liberator. All that. He and the other Massachusetts senator, Henry Wilson, both of them, big abolitionists, they did not support that bill. They voted against that bill. No, we don't want the refugees
Right.
distributed up here in proportion to the population of the states. Horace Greeley, same thing. He was a famous newspaper. He was the newspaper publisher for the New York Tribune, which was either the largest or second largest newspaper in the country.
And you actually talk about it on page 44 is that only 6 of the 22 Civil War Union loyal states let blacks vote. That's it. And even though the blacks are only a tiny percentage of the northern population, I mean, it's like it's like they're freaking fake. I mean, it's all fake. Sumner, Massachusetts, all these guys, and then some of these laws of segregation were based on what they saw in the North. In Pennsylvania, maybe it's Massachusetts, I can't remember, but I was like, I mean, again, and you're sitting there thinking, these guys, they leave those people down there. We don't want them up here, but
no.
We want
In 1910, which was about 50 years after the Civil War started, 90% of America's blacks still lived in the South 50 years later.
Yeah.
And the laws that brought blacks into the political scene were the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. Those would allow give the minorities the right to vote, and it would give them citizenship and that sort of thing. When California approved those two amendments?
When?
About 1960.
Oh, man.
California, the most liberal state in the damn country, who think of themselves as morally superior in every way to the South, they opposed both of those amendments. Well, especially the 14th Amendment, because they didn't want any Orientals, or I guess the proper term is Asian. And in fact, 2/3 there were lynchings in California during the 19th century, and 2/3 of the victims were Asian Americans. And the biggest lynching in the country's history was in Los Angeles in 1873. Wow. And the victims were all Chinese American.
Really?
Including one woman. There were 19 people killed or hanged or executed, and it was during the Grant administration, 1873. And that's another point that a lot of people miss. President Grant was the first man elected president after blacks had the right to vote under the 14th Amendment, and he received, despite the fact that he had. He was hugely popular because he won the war.
Right.
And 3 of the southern states were not permitted to vote. The rest of them that did vote were puppet regimes. He only won a minority of the nation's white vote. He did not win a majority of the white vote. It was the black vote that put him in. And that's the real key to why the Republicans backed the 14th Amendment. You'll hear them say, well, we did it because we wanted to be fair to the blacks. We wanted civil rights. We are just morally, we are morally pure. And that's why we put the 14th Amendment through. No, they did it because they wanted to win the elections. If you look at it this way, in 1845, every state that joined the Union from 1845 to 1959, up to Alaska and Hawaii, every one of them, well, there were 22, all except 2 had about 1% of their population as black. Only about 1%. The 2 exceptions were West Virginia and Oklahoma, border southern states. But the blacks were not wanted in those areas.
Right.
And they pretend like they were so noble, but they didn't want blacks there. Mm-hmm. And in fact, what they really wanted was to quarantine the blacks in the South. Yeah. Until World War I, when there was a worker shortage and blacks started going to Chicago, Detroit, places like that. But not until World War I.
You talk about that throughout this, about the inherent racism of the northern saviors, the Sumners in the world and stuff, the Thaddeus Stevens and whatnot. It's just like the blatantly racist, and they didn't care about the blacks. They just cared about the vote to keep the Republican Party in power. It's just no other way. I mean, there's just no way to see that is not true. And they can make the moral argument. Well, we care. Okay, maybe, but at the end of the day, they just wanted the power of the black votes. There's no other way. And I'm telling you, Phil, I'm reading that. I'm like, holy crap. The Republicans of yesteryear are the Democrats today. That's why they have the BLM stuff and all this. They want to keep the blacks rabble-roused, and they want to have a divide. Like you said, the bloody shirt thing for the Northerners. The bloody shirt. You know what I'm saying? And it's no different than today. The George Floyd, blacks, you better vote for us on the Democrat side because Republicans are going to be more. It's the same thing, and yet it's so frustrating because at the end of the day, a lot of whites are saying, yeah, I better vote for the Republicans because if not, then whatever. It's the same. It's just this, it's the false dichotomy that says we have these two dividing line between, we'll say blacks and whites. It's more than that now, but it's just, you have given so many examples too of how, if blacks, the poor whites and the blacks were able to kind of unify against the monopolists and industrialists and the aristocrats, you even said that we never know what could have happened in the South. It's so frustrating. You know what I'm saying? Because you're sitting there thinking if they could have just seen that they were both being played by puppet regimes in the North and the carpetbaggers and stuff, and they couldn't. It's too bad. You just wonder what would have transpired among the racial harmony if they didn't fall for just bad actions on the lead, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, what I'm hopeful of is that the Afghanistan debacle will convince Americans that all of this progressive agenda has gone so far to the realm of fantasy. We can't have somebody that lives in a world of fantasy running our country. Now, for example, yesterday, the Supreme Court in the state of Virginia unanimously approved the ability of the state to take the Robert E. Lee statue down from Monument Avenue in Richmond.
Yeah.
It's a gigantic statue, so that's going to be a big deal. But nonetheless, here's my point. Robert E. Lee was a great leader. There was certainly not any commander during the war who was more beloved by his own soldiers than Robert E. Lee. And one reason is that he typically slept in a tent.
Yeah.
The other commanders, particularly from the North, would, they would, go to the most prosperous residents in the neighborhood and say, I'm going to make this my headquarters temporarily. And the owner would be happy because that means they're not going to burn down my house.
Right.
But Lee always slept in a tent. And then at Gettysburg, which was his biggest failure, at Gettysburg, after Pickett's charge, he rode out on his horse Traveler. And as the defeated Confederates were returning from the Union lines, he told them, he said, all of this is my fault. No one else is to blame but me. And right there, spontaneously, and he continued that kind of thing. And he met soldiers of all ranks.
Yeah.
He told them that. And they saw that. And they remained loyal.
Yeah.
When he finally got his army, and when the newspapers wrote critical articles on him, he didn't go out and fight them. He didn't say anything. But when he finally got his army safely back in Virginia, he sent his battle report back to President Davis, and the soldiers did a great job. There's nothing wrong with the soldiers. I take responsibility for the defeat, and I submit my resignation. If you feel you can, and give you an opportunity to appoint another general. Of course, Jefferson Davis turned it down. So much different than Biden.
Oh.
So much different than Biden. Biden, this guy, my predecessor, he negotiated this deal, and of all the deals that I broke earlier this year, this was the one I had to keep, and it's all his fault. And we're going to get all the Americans out, and they don't get all the Americans out. And it's such difference in leadership, and what we're doing by tearing down that statue, as we're saying, all those virtues are meaningless. The only virtue that matters is that you were not a slaveholder. Right. And was that really a virtue of somebody who really grew up in, say, Pennsylvania, who never, or maybe a better child would be Vermont or Minnesota, and never had a chance to own a slave. Didn't necessarily make them virtuous, but I think at some point this country will find that they want leaders with the virtue that Robert E. Lee displayed, and by taking it down, you may damage, you may inhibit the ability of America to draw on people that respect that kind of virtue.
Well, don't forget, they took the statue down of that, I think it's a Scottish or Swedish immigrant in Wisconsin who joined the Union, and I think he got killed or something like that. And they took his statue down in Wisconsin. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not sure of the Swedish guy. I think there were, I know they recently moved to Rock that was somehow became racially controversial. But we are, you know, this identity politics is the, I don't know how long it will last, but it's poison to this country.
Oh, 100%.
It's absolutely poison. You know, there's an interesting point. I don't know if you've thought about this, but there's a theory that half of the work of a company or an organization is done by 10% of the people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if you've got like 100, if your company has 100 employees, half of the work is being done by 10. If you've got what it would be, I guess 10,000. If you've got 10,000 employees in your company, half of the work is being done by 100. Yeah. So what that means is there's a lot of slack in these big companies, especially the big companies.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's a big number, there's a big difference between 100 and 10,000, yeah, as opposed to say 10 and 100. Yeah. There's only 90 people different, but in the other one, there's 9,900. All that is there's a lot of room for slack. So there's a lot of affirmative action people that can go in there without, you know, without affecting. What you need are small companies to come up and compete with them. Yeah. And so, you know, companies like Amazon and what's the hotel one, where you rent out your home.
Oh, Airbnb. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All that kind of innovative that can change things. But once these companies become big, they become allied with the government because they know they can keep the competition out because if they can just simply outspend the small company on bullshit, yeah, red tape. That's why Coca-Cola will turn its back on the Confederate flag, even though their founder was a former Confederate officer.
Oh, I mean, it's or Vanderbilt, and you talk about. I think in your book you talk about Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I was really angry about that at Vanderbilt.
But I mean, but what I'm saying is, this is where this is all in here. What we're dealing with now is all in here in terms of the railroad interests and stuff like that. The robbing of, just taking advantage of the political largesse of making the Grand Administration rich. Talk a little bit about the carpetbaggers too. So they go to the South. Obviously, they take over the government. They basically have their black voters. The thing in Memphis was interesting, where the Irish were 25% of the population, blacks were 50%. But it's very interesting. All people should get the book and read all that. The interesting thing was, though, again, they raised the property tax in order to fund the federal government. A lot of the federal government was going to the union pensions to buy out voters. And if you didn't pay the property tax, the carpetbaggers could then confiscate your property and do it as would they want. I'm just sitting there. It was like the purest get-rich scheme there could possibly be. And I'm thinking about, from Maine. So the guy from Maine became a senator in Mississippi and basically stole from the state. He finally got let out. I mean, he didn't get killed or anything, but then he just fled. It's just like they picked the carcass dry, and then essentially they let the whites and the blacks to fight it out. It's freaking these guys who claim this holier than thou from the North, and this is coming from a Yankee. Yeah. You all kiss my butt because you're like, no, you came down to do nothing but get rich off the backs of the Southern people in their time of need, and it forever should be shamed. So, but we're going to go after the Robert E. Lee statue, but we're not going to say anything about the Grand Administration freaking, in terms of the complete corruption, or about the carpetbaggers and the inherent damage they did for 5 generations of racial relations. Yeah. It's absolutely disgusting.
Well, no, you make good points. There is one important correction. The property taxes would go to the state government. Okay. Not the federal. They go to the state government. But what you'll find is the Eric Foner and people like that are the professors that teach Reconstruction. They'll say, well, these carpetbag governments were very good. Look at what they did. Yep. Come on.
I was like, is that me or you? So I gotta make sure mine's turned off too.
I thought I had it turned off. So the corruption would be at the state level.
Yes, okay.
So the Eric Foner will teach you that if you look at the constitutions
Right.
of the carpetbag states, they were very progressive. You know,
Right.
there would be free public education, deaf people and blind people would be taken care of, and this, that, a lot of social programs were in there relative to what kind of social programs were available in the other states at that time. But you had to pay for them. Well, so the taxes went up dramatically. The property taxes went up, and blacks didn't own property by and large. And so that, you know, they're all for, yeah, raise the taxes, you know. And then when the taxes got raised, a lot of property did get sold, you know, at auction. And a lot of the buyers were the well-connected carpetbaggers who knew what was coming up, and then they could buy those properties cheap. I mean, in my home state of Arkansas, I think the governor ended up owning 85,000 acres of cotton, and there was other payoffs all along the way. Yeah, it really links into what Rhett Butler said in Gone with the Wind. He says you can make money on the rise of a country and also the collapse of a country.
Well, then they took on all this debt. Like, you give example after example after example of these carpetbag governors when, you know, they started with hardly any debt, and then when the government falls, finally, there's millions of dollars of debt. So they not only were they able to confiscate the land from the property owners who couldn't pay the taxes, a lot of times probably the poor Confederate soldiers, but on top of that, they took on all this government debt to spend. And of course, the new government comes in and says, how are we going to pay this debt? The idea, if there's any reparations, it shouldn't come from Southerners. That's all there is to it, because they already paid. And that was ultimately, because I'm actually inclined, you know, my parents are hippies. My mom gave me a Malcolm X book when I was 17 years old. I've always been inclined to say, yeah, the blacks got a raw deal, and they have. And I was somewhat inclined to say reparations. I get no qualm with that, because I do think, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of elitists that from the northern and even the southerners too, but the poor people didn't have it. And then reading this book, I recognized no way should be the reparations from the poor in the South, because they already paid it. There's just no other way around that. And so I was stunned, and I'm actually against reparations, because now the idea that just because you're white means you have this kind of privilege is just it's silly enough space. Never mind blatantly racist. There's
not anymore, because the preferential treatment with affirmative action, all that sort of, and you look at the big companies, there's so much room in there for it used to go to the nephews and,
yes.
And all that sort of thing, and that still happens. Those people don't get hurt, but it's the regular whites in the middle that do. 100%. And it's just a reality that the elites that are running this country don't recognize yet. But I am hopeful with Biden showing that there's just nothing there behind all of these wonderful sounding ideas. There's just no substance to them. There's no capability to lead the country. That the Americans will say, you know, we do need to go back to traditional values.
Well, I think it's the lines being drawn. Actually, I'm optimistic, because I think the biggest line being drawn wasn't even, you know, that General Milley is still in charge. Like, why he didn't offer his resignation like Robert E. Lee did, I don't know. I mean, the guy's a nut. But at the end of the day, I don't even think that's it. The Afghanistan thing, I think, is just It's just blatantly obvious just how insane these people are. But I think it's the COVID stuff. I truly, truly believe the line in the sand is being drawn there, and as such, we have basically a bunch of people who are okay to be obedient, and a bunch of people says, yeah, I don't want to be obedient. I want to do my own thing. I actually am very optimistic that line is, you have to make a choice, and the choice is going to be, I'm going to do my own thing, or I'm going to follow whatever the government says. Because whatever the government says today, they can say more tomorrow, as we see in Australia. So that's where I think that Afghanistan insanity is just kind of the icing on the cake, that at some point there's a line being drawn. It's not racial, which is fantastic. I could not be happier, because the immorality as a Christian of saying, you know, looking at people based on skin color is insane. But I just keep going back, and I'm sitting there thinking, these guys, we don't learn the history. You know, we're getting the Tulsa stuff, but I never knew about the thing in LA that you just said. I never knew that. And I don't know if any Chinese, I imagine some do. I don't know, but that's nuts. I never knew that. And where's Eric Foner? And then Eric Foner is saying, oh, the Reconstruction was so good. Well, it wasn't good. It wasn't good. I mean, it was inherently not good because, that's what's, and I won't take that too much more time. Talk a little about the Union Leagues. That we hear about the Klan.
Yeah.
But we don't hear about the Union Leagues. I thought that was very interesting. Talk about that if you don't mind, Phil.
Well, when the slaves were freed, it was a shock to be in freedom. And so in order to organize them into a voting bloc, it turned out that the Union Leagues turned out to be a good way for that to become sort of like a fraternity that would support the Republican candidates. And initially they were Northern whites that did that, because the Union Leagues were established during the Civil War up north, and they're still prominent. The members in the New York Union League, the Philadelphia Union League, those are prominent citizens today.
Oh, that's what that is. Oh, yeah. I know exactly. In Philadelphia, the Union League.
Yeah, but the Union Leagues in the South were just little log cabin chapters. But what they became, where the blacks could meet and they could have secret handshakes and everything. And then they had white leaders that would tell them, what to vote. In those days, they couldn't read or write. Right. So they voted by ballot color. And so he would tell them, look, you got to, in this election, you got to take the yellow ballot and put it in this box. And so they would learn all that there. And they would get promised like we're gonna make the government's going to provide more services, and it's going to be property taxes, and unless you own property tax, you're not going to be affected. And I like that. Right. And then you can't trust your old master. You can't trust your old. He's going to re-enslave you, and all that. It was basically an indoctrination thing, and they did it sometimes get violent because it was like a religion. Like, you got to join this. If other blacks, if you don't join this, then you're a traitor to your own race. And sometimes they did get violent, and there were some deaths. But I don't think it was as much deaths as the Ku Klux Klan. But nonetheless, it was an indoctrination network, and it led the blacks to become loyal to the Republican Party.
100%. That's all it was. It's a loyalty. It's no different than. I mean, it's literally. I'm just sitting there thinking, this is identical to to the Red Guard, to the Maoist youth. I mean, all this. Like, you're going to be loyal to the Republican Party as opposed to being loyal to generating your own freedom, learning how to read and write, and all that stuff. And then on top of that, you talk about how they gathered together and did some, again, not Knight Rider stuff, but they had some prevalence to violence, and they killed people too. And then you talk about some women were tarred and feathered in some. Well,
that's right. See, the Union League started, I think, in Illinois in 1862. So what was happening is that was a midterm election.
Yeah.
Okay, a midterm election. Lincoln got elected in 1860. You have a midterm election coming out in 1862, and they were beginning to see that Lincoln's party was losing. He wasn't up for re-election himself, but Lincoln's party was losing in the midterms. Yeah. So the Union Leagues were formed, and what they would do is, if you were a non-Republican, if you were against Lincoln, they would tar and feather you and run you out of the town. And this happened in places like Illinois, Indiana, and that sort of thing. Then it became an obvious Lincoln supporters were like, well, the Union League is really a big supporter of Lincoln. So then, as the Republican Party gained power, then you have the Union League of Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and all that sort of thing. But in the Reconstruction era, it just became a network of ways for blacks to organize themselves and learn how to vote with colored ballots, because they had no idea.
Learn how to vote loyalty to the Republican Party. I tell you, man, I'm sitting there thinking, it's not. By the way, folks, the Klan was in Maine. Just FYI. I mean, the Klan was in Maine in the as late as the 1920s, and rather prominent as well. So for people who think that there's no such thing as a Ku Klux Klan up north, they're completely wrong. I know that for a fact. So not that I was part of it.
Yeah, but it's interesting that the Anti-Defamation League right now, in September 2021, estimates the total number of Klan members in the United States is 3,000.
Exactly.
So, when people lecture about, the white supremacy threat and all that sort of thing, and they mention the Ku Klux Klan, it's nothing. It's nothing.
There's nothing.
I don't know how all this is going to work out, but I believe that Robert E. Lee provides the model of leadership that Biden and all the people associated with him could never touch, and that this country is going to lose if we lose respect for that kind of
That's what I was going to say about the Union League saying they're going to put you back in chains back then. I said, oh, that sounds like sniffy Joe Biden. Remember he said that? He said to a group of blacks, they're going to put you all back in chains. He's talking about Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney. It's like, I mean, come on, freaking Biden. Mitt Romney, the most milquetoast Republican ever. I mean, it's like, dude, it's like deja vu. All right. So how long did it take you to write? I mean, there's so many footnotes, so much documentation, man. I mean, how long did it take you to write this?
It was probably the better part of a year for the whole project.
Yeah.
But like I say, I mean, I started it with like, just like you would when some snake oil salesman come in with some big new investment.
Right.
Your clients. Yeah, you want to hear what he's saying because he might be the right guy, but you also want to be very careful about what he did say and look for the mistakes. And that's kind of the way I approached it. And there's just so much left out because of the bias in the way the history is reported. In fact, what's happened now is like academic historians are like fish in water. Yeah. They have their own environment and they think that, that's the environment that everybody else is in. But we're out here living on the land and the air, and we know the Southern perspective is different. It doesn't mean it's a bad perspective. It just means it's different. And we should have a right to say it, at least in this country, but we don't have that right.
Well, as
so they shut us down.
Make sure you get a hard copy or just a paperback, but get the actual book itself because Amazon can easily take that off the freaking the Kindle. I mean, heaven forbid it had a Confederate flag on there. It doesn't. Are you and how many other books do you have, Phil?
About 6 or 7.
Oh,
I would recommend. Well, of course, I recommend all of them, but I think that if somebody is interested in just the Civil War itself, I've got the Confederacy at Flood Tide, which looks at the period when the South came closest to winning its independence from June of 62 to December of 62. I've got Trading with the Enemy, which has sort of led me into the fellow from Maine. His father-in-law was General Butler in Massachusetts. Yes. Beast Butler in New Orleans because he ran a crooked operation down there after they occupied New Orleans. But Trading with the Enemy, about twice as much cotton in the South was sold to Northerners as went through the maritime blockade to Great Britain. So Trading with the Enemy was a significant aspect of the war that, again, Northerners don't like to look at because they don't look so great.
Right. Even though they were, and the people who were picking that cotton were slaves. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like, I hate, buying a Chinese-made good off the slavery in the communist China. You know what I'm saying? As I was sitting out there saying how bad America is for civil rights, but give me my iPhone so I can. The whole thing's nuts. What are you working on right now?
I'm working on a book about critical race theory.
Oh, okay, interesting. So this is not historical, or is it a kind of historical?
Well, I came to the conclusion a couple of months ago that if critical race theory and so-called anti-racism, if they gain any more traction, then every single Confederate monument will be destroyed.
Even in the South too, because look at Virginia. I mean, literally.
It'll happen. It'll happen. It's absolute poison. It's not. It's phony.
Yeah.
It takes advantage of white guilt.
Oh.
Blacks. What happened in the 60s is the United States and the South, including the South, but mostly just the United States, made a confession. They went to like their priest and they made a confession.
Right.
We have been racist, and we've a lot of people we've abused, and we want to confess to this. And what do we need? What do we need to do? And the priest says, well, pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and then go say your Hail Marys and you're done. And so. So the whole nation made this confession, but it's like a marriage. It's like, say, the spouse that is cheated goes to the spouse that didn't cheat and confesses, and then, well, what kind of moral authority does he or she have once they confess?
Right.
The victim will always hold that up as a, you owe me this, you owe me that, unless that victim, forgives and realize that you cannot have a successful marriage if you're constantly asking for free gifts and for concessions that you have not earned. you know, and that's what we're facing as a nation right now. The black power comes from white guilt.
Oh yeah.
And the black power is a negative kind of power. It's not the kind of power, interesting, that Malcolm X wanted.
I know, not at all.
Malcolm X said, you don't want any help from the whites. Let's just do this on our own.
Yes.
Whatever we accomplish, let's accomplish on our own. That's exactly what W.E.B. Du Bois said in the early 20th century, and even Booker T. Washington in the 19th century. Earn your own living. That's how you get power, and that's a positive thing. But what we've done is we've given gifts to the blacks in terms of affirmative action, public housing, and all that sort of thing. And what's happened is that 70% or so of the children 18 years or younger of blacks live with a single parent family. Yeah. The women are not married to men; they're married to the government for their paychecks. And you cannot get people to have dignity unless they earn it. I would recommend, if you can get the guy on Shelby Steele, who is
a huge fan of Shelby Steele. Yeah, I'm probably too small for him, Phil. You and I are on the other side, but
I don't know. You may not be, because if you search YouTube, there's not very many places where he's on there. He's been hurt by the fact that he's a rational person, right. But he grew up in Chicago when the schools up there were segregated, even though they weren't legally segregated. His parents formed CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality.
Right. Yes.
And they when they went out, every time they went out to demonstrate, you had to wear a coat and tie.
Yeah.
That was the rule. You could not be one of their demonstrators unless you had a coat or tie. And also, if you got attacked, you were not to hit back. And he eventually got a PhD, and he earned it. But the whole point is that they have, all of us, all people, whether you're white, black, whatever you are, you cannot gain respect for yourself by being given all the things that you need. You have to earn them. And you will not respect yourself one iota more by going out and tearing down a Robert E. Lee statue.
No, that's not. Well, there's, believe it or not, there's a growing sentiment among the blacks that I think has happened. There's a guy named Kwame Brown who he was a #1 draft choice in 1999, and he was called a bust in the NBA. And he's got a huge, it just started out, based out of nowhere, this YouTube channel. He's in Brunswick, Georgia, as a matter of fact, talking almost like Booker T. Washington. He goes, we got to teach skills. We got to teach trades, farming, electric. And his YouTube channel is taken off like crazy about black men need to get back to what they were good at, which is marriage. It's insane. And there's a guy at England called Zuby, another kind of rapper, but there's a lot of underneath what you see with the idiots, Jesse Jacksons and Kendi and these clowns. There's a lot of, you just see it, and it's wonderful. And
well, Kendi is just a younger Al Sharpton.
Oh yeah, 100%. He's a grifter.
And he's 38 years old or 39. And I promise you, 30 years from now, he's still going to have the same complaints.
And I guarantee
it doesn't matter what he accomplishes, but that's why. But if you look at it, think about basketball and athletics and music, jazz, stuff like that. Yeah. The blacks that are good at that, they compete with people of all races. They compete. They make themselves compete against a standard of excellence,
right?
Not a standard of affirmative action.
They're there every single day. Put in the time, put in the labor. I know.
And that's how they come out on top. And so especially in basketball, they will do it. The kid out there that makes it, he's going to be practicing every day, and if he doesn't dribble well, he's going to learn how to dribble better. But nobody's going to go out there and give him a hug that because I need to help you with your self-esteem. I don't need I'll get my self-esteem by getting respect from the other players, whatever their race. So they can do it. They can do it.
Yes.
But the white elite that runs the colleges and that runs the politics here, that thinks that they don't really care what the result is.
No,
they want to be perceived as the anti-racist, the person that gives the gifts, that makes all this fun.
They want to be seen as the white savior. That's what it's called. I'm the great white savior. And the self-esteem that's built is when you hit the jump shot, not because some white savior put you on the floor just because you're black. And people, everyone knows this. It's just the idea that to say that makes you somehow kind of, ooh, I don't know if I want to touch that. But it's coming. I feel it. I do. And I got 4 kids, Phil. And you know, my oldest is just 21. She'll graduate from Georgia Tech here this year. But so I don't know if they're millennials or what generation that is, but you can just feel that there's a seismic change. I think that's why I'm optimistic, actually, because I think at the end of the day, most people don't want the great white savior. And if you think back to SPLC, you know, Morris Dees, that scumbag, and all these rich white Northerners just sending money. And he's white, but we all know what he was doing. I don't want to say that because I don't want anyone to sue me, but we know what the SPLC was doing. And let's just put it this way.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem is that, Steve Jobs' wife.
Yes. Yeah. 100%.
She's worth $21 billion. And if somebody convinces her that the white Southerners are evil and they need to have all of their Confederate statues, she'll fund it.
100%.
Yeah, but
Mackenzie Bezos, same thing. Or Mackenzie Bezos and the Jeff and Bill Gates is what Melinda Gates.
Bezos is interesting because I think he was valedictorian, and then it's really his adoptive father.
Yes, his adoptive father's Cuban. It's very interesting. Yes.
But I'm disappointed that he won't stand up for what they're doing. It's cultural genocide.
Oh, 100%.
And I think that there'll come a time, I hope, I probably won't live to see it, that these people be respected again, and that there'll be a confession to having destroyed the Southern culture, or this country just may fall apart because of all this reckless spending.
Well, I think, Phil, is that the idea that it's just the Southern country culture being destroyed. Anyone who has any kind of white in them, their culture is being destroyed too because of critical race theory and things like that. If you're white, you're guilty inherently, and that's just that doesn't just apply to a guy from Arkansas. That applies to a guy from Maine as well. So if for all you out there thinking, I don't live in the South, I don't like the South, yeah, it's already here. It's coming. So be prepared. All right. So I'll let you get out of here. So you have a YouTube channel. Are you running an active blog or anything like that, Phil, or what?
Civil War Chat.
So okay, good. I have looked at that. I think I got your info. So we got books on Amazon. I'll put links in the show notes. We got a YouTube channel, Civil War Chat, the blog, lots of books. What's the ETA on your critical race theory book? You think?
Well, that's a tough question. I feel maybe I shouldn't have even mentioned what I'm working on because that's a tough question. But you know why? It's the same thing. I'm having to learn stuff I don't know anything about. Well, I have my opinions. So right. Every opinions are like,
assholes. We all have one.
Yeah. And so I have opinions, but I'm reading Kendi's book. I've read this damn book, and I'm reading other books to get their perspective. Okay. Yeah. And really it's fantasy. They all basically want a free ride, but you get no self-respect out of a free ride. In fact, Kendi's parents are old school. Yeah. They tried to teach him, personal responsibility, self-reliance. That's what it takes. And of course, I don't know whether he's just a 39-year-old teenager rebelling against his parents.
That's 100% guaranteed.
I don't know about that because I'm sure they're proud of what he's accomplished. And his book is an interesting. I like the way he writes. But he takes in his, how to be an anti-racist. It's basically autobiographical, and he tells you how he comes up at different times with his different viewpoints of white people. And here's an example. He was in private school until high school. Then in high school, he went to a public school, but he was in the International Baccalaureate program, which is a gifted thing. But it was a predominantly black school, and there were 3 white people up front. That he thought were the teacher's pet, but nonetheless, it came time for Martin Luther King birthday, a contest. Everybody can write a speech about Martin Luther King, and we'll have a contest and see who would be the winner. And so he writes one, he shares it with another black girl in the class, and then the morning of the competition, he oversleeps.
Right.
He oversleeps. He comes into class late, and his friend, who was a girl, begged the teacher, let Kendi, please let him talk, or Ibram, let him talk. And so he gave a speech and he won the contest, and that's really kind of what launched him. But I just wonder if a white student overslept, this white student goes to the teacher, well, I missed. Well, why'd you miss? Well, I overslept.
Right.
What the hell is the teacher going to do? Right?
Not
going to let him in his. But then, so I think he got preference there. So I'm reading a lot of the books that represent the opposite side, and I'm trying to figure out how to fit it in. And Shelby Steele, in my opinion, does a good job of that.
Well, it's funny you say, because I got this book right here, COVID-19, The Great Reset by old Klaus Schwab. And because same thing, I'm not writing a book on it, but I'm interested in his perspective, because I can't stand the guy. But with that said, I think the best arguments are one against a certain philosophy, or when you know what the philosophy is, other than just reading tidbits of it. And it's kind of like if the best way to defend the faith, apologetics, is to know what the arguments are against the faith, not just the tried and true. So it sucks that you have to do that, but someone's got to do it, and it's better you than me, because I would go insane if I had to read that crap. And Robin DiAngelo, I think I'd jump off a bridge. So but all right, I'll let you get out of here, Phil. But this is great, man. Hang tight real quick. Hold on just a